Every tier list video is like 50 minutes long, 30 minutes long, so stop wasting your time and just look at our tier list videos. Let's get straight into it. We'll start with the Baron lane. Here we have Camille for the carry tier, still one of the most broken picks in the game. With right patches as they are, there are not many changes throughout the patches. However, items and new item builds that emerge kind of change up things. But in this regard, like, we have barely any changes for the Baron lane. The only thing you can say is that, for example, Renekton got significantly worse than before with the rune changes, but other champions are still as potent as ever. One of the arguments you could always make is, why are some champions in the A tier, not in the S tier? For example, Wukong is insane, Gragas is insane, and Pantheon is insane, as well as Jace. The issue with Jace, however, is that he is very susceptible to just getting ran over, and that's kind of it, especially in the Baron lane. Other champions, such as Jax and Fiora, are very strong in the current patch, and are also, well, Fiora is a direct counter to Jax, but you know what I mean? Like, these champions are very powerful when it comes to split pushing and overall taking over the game. And Akali is just Akali. You press your third ability, jump in, jump around, and instantly kill people without them even being able to react. Other champions in the B tier, however, just don't do too much. With the exception of actually Teemo this patch, this champion does a lot of extra damage, so you shouldn't underestimate this champion. However, in the carry tier, Camille is just the best champion. She pushes, she can teamfight, she can do everything, and everything below is just substantially weaker in comparison. Also for this patch, carry top laners, unless you get really fed, will not be strong enough to carry games against super fed bot lanes. If you're equally as fed on top lane, or rather the Baron lane, and the AD carry lane, well, Dragon lane, then you probably end up losing unless they have terrible champions. However, on the tanky side, for example, when you have the orange champion, the wholesome orange champion, you'll be absolutely set up for success. You will not die because nobody's able to actually kill you outside of a few champions, which are, well, conveniently in the S or SS tier for the Baron lane, and AD carries will struggle with you anyway. And all the other champions are very nice when it comes to supplementing all your teammates. AD carries really struggle with killing Mundo if the Mundo is good in the game. Garen is the same. Even Sion is an absolute machine when it comes to tankiness, but Orange just takes the cake. He ults through a teamfight, and then you're actually just doomed. There's not much you can do about this one because the Cult the Forge God can only be blocked by, for example, Samira, Yasuo Windwall, and Braum Shield. And if you don't have any of these tools available, you'll get knocked up and lose all of your HP bar and get completely obliterated instantly after. Just a lovely champion that provides a lot of utility, which seems to be a very good call if you're playing in a duo or trio environment with your other laners, especially Dragon laners. For the jungle role, we have a lot of problems, and here we have Evelynn as the best champion in the game. You can also say that Kayn is similarly as good, but Evelynn just takes it all. Boots of Mana, Prophet's Pendant, Sudden Impact, and you have a 2400 gold spike with 33 magic pen and percentage pen on her second ability, which will instantaneously kill people. And even in the late game, she'll just one-shot people thanks to Proto Belt and even Flash in her third ability. You'll just send into Narnia. Other champions such as Kayn are similarly as strong because they barely have any counterplay in the sense of, they just walk through walls and hit their second ability on you and you can't do too much against them. The same thing goes to Kha'Zix, but Kha'Zix is weaker than the other champions, but if played well and really played around power spikes, then things get really messy. However, there's one thing that Kha'Zix really struggles with, and that is death stance with plated steel caps. If you're, for example, an Aatrox player, and you see the enemy team has a Kha'Zix, just get death stance and plated steel caps, and the Kha'Zix player will actually cry in agony. In the last patch, we thought about Gwen being still as good as before, but with the recent nerf, she even dropped further, and we made an adjustment to Wukong, putting him into S tier, whereas Gwen is now in the B tier due to her farming. She is just way too slow. Other champions you see in the B tier, for example Lilia, on paper don't seem as bad, but the issue with all the damage in the game right now, Lilia just dies too fast unless she's super fed, and even if she's super fed, if any enemy carry that is just having any type of CC or burst, Lilia will die before she can do anything. So for the jungle department, we have consistent champions, less consistent champions, and really inconsistent champions. That's basically the reason why these champions are differentiated in the way they are, and with an exception of Lee Sin, if you're really good at Lee Sin, this champion can be very consistent, especially in a bad solo queue environment. For the tank department, we have Volibear as the king of the jungle. This champion just doesn't die, and he yeets into your face, dives you, and just accelerates the game, which is basically the name of the game right now. Gank Dragon lane. Gank, 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 dive, 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 dive. And this is exactly what Volibear does really well, as well as Rammus, Nautilus, and even Shen. The other champions a bit lower, for example, Amumu or Nunu can do the same, yes, but Amumu is really powerful when it comes to just sneaking Baron and taking over the game from that point, especially also in teamfight scenarios. So if there was an adjustment I would make to this list as of now, I would put Amumu into probably S tier, or just basically have him in both tiers depending on the game. Like, he's a decent champion, to say the least. For the mid lane, we have a slight problem. Zoe has been nerfed, Boots of Mana have been nerfed, but this champion is still very oppressive and she will kill you. The reasoning is the following. Zoe would not one-shot you in the early to mid game, where these nerfs are really hitting hard. Zoe would poke you out and then on a second rotation you would die, and that is still the case. So in that manner, nothing really much changed. However, the biggest change we can think about is the Annie rework. But there's one problem. If you look at Annie as a champion, which champions does she struggle with? Every other mage in the S tier or above really just kind of spits on Annie, and Annie really has a one-dimensional playstyle. She has Flash as a tool, Protobelt as a tool, and her Tibbers, and that's basically it. Yes, if you're consistently getting flanks off and the enemy is very oblivious as to what you're doing, then Annie will feel very powerful, but the other champions that are above are just way more consistent, and the same applies to all the other champions in this list. However, there's one champion that I am not really certain about, and it's Twisted Fate. I have really mixed results and experiences with this champion, but the First Strike Nuclear Explosion build seems really potent as of right now. So I think putting TF into the B tier is not really the play anymore, but maybe more into the A tier, but for now we'll keep him here and just see how it develops. But other than this, the champions will be relatively same in the sense of power level. For the assassins, we have a Zed in the pinnacle tier, simply because this champion is very annoying to deal with. However, other champions, for example Diana or Akali or even Fizz, could even compete with Zed right now, simply because of how broken the interaction between Prophet's Pendant, Sudden Impact, and Boots of Mana is. And even Ahri got substantially stronger thanks for these Boots of Mana giving an earlier power spike, which really plays into how you want to play her. Rotations, and roaming. Champions that are constantly able to reliably get their boots as their first item with the most powerful tool they can have, because Ahri also has the 2400 gold power spike with 33 pen if she chooses to, makes it really difficult for the enemy to even breathe. And other champions in the A tier, for example Echo, who could be the S tier as well, are similarly as strong, but sadly fail in a sense of the comparison in burst. Kassadin, on the other hand, takes too long to scale and is very susceptible to just having the game go past without him being able to do anything. However, if you consider that the current ranked climate is really random and so many random fights happen, Kassadin can still pop off simply because he is an AP champion. If you didn't get the memo, AP champions are broken. For the other tier, we still have Jace as the pinnacle champion, but you could just do Corki in there as well. In the past, I mentioned that Akshan isn't as strong anymore in the sense of carrying, but he still has an obnoxious laning phase and can get ahead really easily. With that in mind, he can also just play around the jungle and make games really problematic for the enemy team. But if there's a change I would actually look into, I would maybe perhaps put Tristana a little bit higher, because Tristana mid lane is not even as bad as people make her out to be. Other champions such as Jhin, Lucian, and Corki are just absolutely toxic for the mid lane if you go for lane pressure. The biggest issue, however, is outside of Jhin and Corki, the other champions don't scale as well unless you're talking about Tristana. Every other champion in the A or B tier is simply not a blind pick. You should always consider the matchup really well, and it's more of a team effort when you want to go for these champions. But you won't get enough wins with these champions because they can't get more advantages or enough advantages to compensate for how the game goes. And biggest issue here is that they're fully committal champions, and committal champions in an environment where people are not good and not following your engages or plays will get you killed, and if you die, you're most likely just losing. Now let's talk about the AD carry picks. Here we have Corki as one of the most broken champions in the game. And if this was competitive, you would have Corki Varus every single second of your day. And maybe down the line you would maybe pick up Kai'Sa. Other champions such as Azriel, Tristana, Jhin, they are not as powerful in a sense of a solo queue environment, but still they have their place. You can still blind pick Jhin, don't get me wrong, but other champions might just, well, walk over you. Other champions, for example, like Neela, require a specific build, for example, Shieldbow, Bloodthirster, Infinity Edge, and Lord Doms into a defensive item to really function well. And you have to understand how your champion works to really get the advantages. But if you're into a fully poke lane, you'll get absolutely demolished if you don't know what you're doing. For the A tier, I want to talk about two champions specifically. I want to talk about Caitlyn and Misfortune. A very well played Caitlyn, especially in a duo that is with a ranged champion, takes off everyone in the S tier. She'll simply stomp them. However, the issue is other champions are not really as interactive. For example, Corki, Varus and Ezreal can play the lane without interacting at all. A Beth, on the other hand, can really be a bully if the enemy is oblivious as to what you're doing. Hitting enemies with your first ability and having Kraken available really dishes out a lot of damage, which will allow you to kill the enemy easier. The other champions in the A tier, however, are just very, very weak. And if anything, probably I would put Vayne in the B tier because this champion cannot win lane unless you're playing against actual AI. This champion is pitifully weak right now and requires a Lulu to actually do anything. And if you see any Vayne succeeding, please take a look at their laning phase. They're not winning because they're good, they're winning because the enemy is absolutely lost in space. And now we move over to the mage tier. Lux has received nerfs to her shield, but that doesn't really matter to her. She still can hit through minions, she has a lot of damage, and first strike gives her actual bank. Therefore, she is just still broken. For the skill order now, you would max your third ability first, and then your second ability, because you still get a massive value of the shield and the cooldown and everything is just powerful, but you still go for maximum damage. No supportive items, pure damage. Every other champion in the S tier is more conditional and requires you to know more about the enemy team to just pick them. The exception here would be Orianna, but Orianna is very slow in a sense of scaling, and all the other champions in the S tier scale faster and have an earlier impact on the game. However, Orianna, once you go into the really late game, similar to a Morgana, makes it very difficult for the enemy team to close out the game or contest objectives, but rather stick with S tier champions than with AT champions in this instance. Now we move over to the support tier, and here we have the engaged tier with Rakan being the most broken champion for that tier. The reason for this is a super fast engage with flash and the quickness just going to the heart of the enemy, pulling them all together and just blowing them up with the help of his team. Other champions such as Gragas or Galio are more competitive environment picks, but they're still very powerful in what they do. For solo queue, Thresh and Nautilus will yield way better results because the enemy is simply terrible and they're easier to pilot compared to the other champions. Champions in the A tier, with the exception of a Leona, are not as consistent and require a lot of follow-up. For example, Sett, if he goes in, he is in. If the Alistar goes in, he's also in. Even the Sion will just go deep into the enemy lines, and Leona, on the other hand, can engage the fight from afar with just the ultimate and then can still decide if she wants to go in or not. And don't forget about the Leona bonus damage. If she applies spells on enemy champions, they're marked by sunlight. If you, for example, have a twitch or any dot effect on the enemy champions like a Morgana's second ability, then every single time they deal damage, they'll trigger her sunlight and literally blow up the enemy. So for example, if you want to play a very funny bot lane combo, you can go for Leona and Morgana and proc her passive 4 times in an instant the moment you have ultimate available. You only have to unleash all your spells and then your passive sunlight will be procced, and then Morgana's second ability, because of the execute bonus damage, will deal way more damage and you'll literally blow up people level 5. It's a really fun combo. Well, it's not, especially with the CC changes, it's really toxic. But if you want to win some games and have, well, some fun enjoying the enemy suffering, then go for these champions. For the Protect tier, we have one of the most broken champions in the game. Well, Soraka. Soraka has lost a lot of her laning power from her first ability and second ability's combination. For example, in the past, your first ability healed for 60, and your second ability for 80. And if you hit an enemy with your first ability, you would also transition or apply the healing over time effect on you to an ally, which means that is 80 plus 60, which is 140 healing on level 2, which is really a lot, really a lot. Now, your second ability doesn't do that anymore and only heals for 50 on level 1. But it's an ability you should never take on level 1, so keep that in mind, because if you hit an enemy with your first ability, you yourself heal for 60 and you deal damage to the enemy. So why would you take an ability that only does something for your ally and you can't do anything because you can't deal damage, you can't trade, etc, etc, when Soraka is such a strong champion in the sense of trading. And Soraka has one issue that really makes the game hard for her, and that's 2 champions. It's Lux and Veigar. All the other champions like Janna, Karma, Lami, all these champions are not strong enough to deal with Soraka because they simply don't deal enough damage to kill people. Poke is nowadays useless against Soraka unless you have insane amounts of poke. But the other champions are very strong into Soraka or all-in champions. But the issue here is, if you don't kill the Soraka, which will always be very problematic because she has Relic Shield and Rod of Ages, don't rush Boots of Mana, you don't want that, it doesn't make any sense. You will not kill her, and if the Soraka doesn't die, she'll just out-heal everyone. And if she hits her first ability, her second ability's cooldown will be reduced, and if she times it correctly with the projectile of the first ability, she can instantly heal somebody with 2 second abilities, and that's a lot of burst healing. So yeah, these champions are very problematic, and stay away from Sona. This champion, like compared to all the other champions, why would you ever pick Sona? It just doesn't make any sense. Now, for the carry tier, technically speaking, with Soraka being such a problem in the game, I would have to put Veigar there, right? But I'll not do so. The reason is the following. If you are blind picking into a Soraka as a support champion, it should always be Lux if you want to go for an enchanter or mage-like champion. But if you have more information about the enemy draft, for example, they have a lot of all-in champions that are melee, or just have a low range like a Lucian or a Vayne or any of that kind, Veigar makes the game unplayable for the enemy team. The cage of his just makes it impossible for the enemy to play. Also to keep in mind, you now as a support get relic stacked around 4 minutes into the game. With 4 minutes, only spend 4 minutes, you can now start farming, which is something that's very powerful because many people will just completely disregard sidewaves and not do anything with them. And you can just one-tap them with your second ability and gain a lot of extra AP, which will accelerate your game even faster. To then one-shot the enemy with your first ability into your ult right into their face, because that Soraka cannot out-heal. Plus, keep in mind that your cage completely controls the fight, and it's just too much damage that Soraka can't do anything about. The other champions, for example, such as Pyke, will accelerate their game super fast by their roaming because they're not meant to be played in lane. You'll just go around the map and go for kills, all cooldown. The other champion, for example, Senna, is a very powerful champion when we go into like real higher skill environments because she literally dominates the laning phase, where laning phases matter more. For example, she could go into the Baron lane level 1 and completely obliterate you. And if there happens to be a 2v2 in the Baron lane, you best believe Senna is not gonna lose that. You need to have really bad champions next to the Senna into really powerful champions to not have that happen, or to have that happen rather. And yeah, that's basically a lot because we gave a lot of extra information, but that's kind of the rundown about everything important currently in WildRift. And if you like this video, leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and check out our channel.